This is Monica Perez here with Mystic Mark from the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, ready to bring us a deep dive on the cradle of the cabal, skull and bones. And this is something I've been waiting with bated breath for since he suggested it to me a little while ago. So I really want to hear the whole story, top to bottom. Strap on your tanks. We are going deep with a dive master. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here. How are you doing? I love your whole scene. It gives me a very zen vibe. So thank you for bringing that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thank you. Well, I have sort of a oddballs mix of things. So we have the Buddhist prayer flags, some kind of celestials flag. This guy is a Kachina doll. You might not be able to see him behind the mic stand there, but and then this guy is like a Hindu god. So yeah, I don't know if this is anyone, and Bob Marley, of course, and Sam Tripoli back there too.
Nice.
So yeah, there's a lot going on. We could spend a whole podcast just piecing apart what's behind me, but it's a pleasure to be here. I love this new show, Deep Dives. I think this is awesome, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for accepting my offer of diving into Skull and Bones.
Yes, thank you. I always want to know more. And I feel like if you put in the time and effort, or even just have a little bit of curiosity, you can connect the dots or bring a few little tidbits that other people haven't heard that make things clear. And even just in my cursory examination of Skull and Bones, or refreshing my memory from past research, still I reread it and some of the stuff just blows me away. But I don't want to steal any of your thunder. So you want to just start from the top and tell us, like, what is it? What is Skull and Bones? Why were you even interested in it? And like, let's just go from there.
Yeah, I'd love to start there, and there's no way you could steal the thunder here. This is a collaborative effort. So if you have things that come to mind, please tell me because there is this is an active ongoing research project and it started well
I have to
almost
tell you,
10 years ago.
I'm
Ooh.
at I'm at my mom's,
Mhm.
and there was just a skull sitting on her table that someone found in the backyard. So I thought it was very appropriate for our little conversation.
Oh, wow.
It's a red fox. I put it out on Twitter, and people sent me like little diagrams of different skulls. It's definitely got canines
Check this
and
out. This
forward
is the
looking. Yeah, what you
this
got?
is the mandible of a red fox. So look at
Really? Oh my gosh, because this is only the top.
that. We're gonna put it together and
Oh, okay, I can't.
look at
Ah,
that.
there you go.
It's like some kind of superhero movie in the
Yeah,
making.
right, and then you have this, like, weird fox. But, yeah, so you were started to become interested in this 10 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. 10 years ago, I was freshly out of high school, in college, and I happened to go to college, not at Yale University, but right next door at a community college titled aptly Gateway Community College. And I definitely entered into a gateway and came out on the other side of a whole new world I didn't know existed because growing up where I grew up, New Haven was 5 miles, 10 miles away. But because of the way my life was sort of structured, I just lived in this little suburb and I walked to school, took my bike here and there, never really went to the city much, it was kind of a small town feeling. But when I was about 18, 19, I go to college and I start walking around New Haven. And I'm just taken by the architecture, the environment, the caliber of conversations you could eavesdrop on. I mean, it was a really interesting place to be, especially in 2012 and 2013, because we had this whole Occupy Wall Street movement that had just occurred, and the center portion of New Haven was occupied. The whole green was full of homeless and protesters and all sorts of in-betweeners. But yeah, I kind of jumped into the mix in that milieu, kind of a radical young guy, always questioning authority, questioning the narrative I was given at school. So I was already sort of interested in like the whole Occupy thing and what was going on. So I just made my way downtown to the green as much as I could. And really by then there wasn't anybody on the green. but the energy was there. And at first I thought, oh, it was, something to do with this Occupy Wall Street thing. But really, in hindsight, the green has that energy. It's maintained that energy. And I guess that's why, over the centuries, really, it's been a gathering place for people. And I intuitively tapped into that. And, 10 years ago, that's just the flavor. That was the flavor of the protest. Things have changed much, you know, really drastically since then. But
I
yeah.
I remember the Occupy. It was when I first started in radio, which I had never meant to be in radio, so it's not like there was any progression there. I just somebody asked me, like, found it interesting that basically never heard anybody questioning my what I was questioning was the necessity of government. I
Hmm.
was like, why do we just assume we have to have a government? Like, maybe society is self-ordering. And I started getting turned on to some of that stuff. And Occupy Wall Street was popular at that time, or was, emerging, and I wasn't down the rabbit hole. I never thought that 9/11 was an inside job, any of that. But when I started looking into things because I had to talk about them, I immediately thought, this looks like a Soros setup. They had people on the ground who were holding signs written in English, but who didn't speak English and didn't know what they were doing there, that they were being paid for it. And it is always hard for me to get my mind completely around the dialectic and the controlled opposition, and so much like real value or true things come out of the other side, yet they big T, they always seem to get the upper hand. And I mean, as we go along, I would love to dig a little deeper into, what you think is the true nature of this stuff. And I do think it probably originates in Skull and Bones or other societies like that, where that's, very small group of people really know the true nature of how they shape, how they shape what we focus on, really, how they shape the back and forth of politics. And I have an interesting quote. Maybe I'll read it to make clear what I'm looking for. So there was a quote. This is just right out of Wikipedia, saying Lanny Davis in the 1968 Yale yearbook said, if the society had a good year, the ideal group, like the however many people they tap in a year, a dozen people or something, would consist of a football captain, a chairman of the Yale Daily News, a conspicuous radical, a whiffenpoof, I don't know what that is, a swimming captain, a notorious drunk with a 94 average. So I feel like of these categories, that would probably be the one I would be in. A filmmaker, a political columnist, a religious group leader, a chairman of the Lit, again, I don't know what that is, a foreigner, a ladies' man with two motorcycles, an ex serviceman, a Negro, if there are enough to go around, and a guy nobody else in the group had heard of ever. So I felt like they just start from the beginning with this hodgepodge of people for a reason. And I just thought even Occupy had that, it's a setup, but it is heroic for some people, and there's a reason behind it all.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's take a step back and examine what you just quoted. First of all, whiff and poof is like another. I mean, you could kind of consider them like dandies, but it's like a chorus. So whiff and poof is like a singing group. Yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
JC, the Yale Whiffenpoofs is a collegiate a cappella singing group established at Yale University in 1909. It is the oldest such group in the United
All right,
States.
now JC is stealing my thunder. You weren't.
Sorry, but it's fun. You
I love
said
it.
I'm really trying to like sit back and let my guests say everything, but I like the conversation, and you
Oh
said we
yeah.
could do it that way.
Oh, you could, I don't mind. The whiff and poofs, yeah, I would call them kinda like the dandies, like, culturally, that they're kinda like, men who are a little bit feminine, but that's like a dated
Yeah,
term. So
metrosexual.
yeah, I think that quote is in the context of that time period, because what happened around then was
Right.
there was a shift. The secret societies realized, okay, the jig is up to a certain degree. We can't just be a bunch of stiff white guys with family ties going back a bunch of generations, because people are going to catch on to this, and they already were. So they adopted that, sort of camouflage of let's bring every man into this. I mean, even a Negro if there's enough to go around. I mean, think about how like dated that quote is, but let alone like
Rude.
the idea that we'll include one. It's like South Park token, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
really what that is, and
Right.
and in a way, that's what the secret societies did. They began to do this sort of like identity politics, which, I mean, we've seen how that's evolved through the college system and become a really, sort of step by step with cultural Marxism, right? It's sort of like a precursor to that in a way. So you have quotes from that time period where, secret society members would be very upset if they did not get a tap because they're all, meant to bring the next guy in from the younger class. They didn't, represent their ethnicity somehow with their choice of person. Like a Korean student got so upset because he had to select a Japanese guy, and that was the only Asian, person that was eligible. And he was so upset because it wasn't a Korean person. He felt like he was dishonoring his, lineage or something. So they definitely had this like shift because traditionally the secret societies were, you know, all male and all white,
Yeah,
right? And then they
WASP, right? Protestant
Right.
even.
Well, and then not to mention no Jews, no, Catholics. So yeah, and even more so very specific type of Christian denomination. So all of that slowly, loosened, but really it was always a part of their mindset because you have to understand the Yale and Harvard colleges started as ministries with preachers, right? I mean, pastors, clergymen as the, professors. So it's a religious school by
Mm.
origin. And that religious ideology is a Calvinist ideology. And part
Mm.
of Calvinism is the idea that the elect are chosen by God to fulfill God's will. And, you demonstrate that you are elect by God with wealth. So really their idea is a classist idea, right? And the racism was a part of that for a long time, but as, ethnicities sort of uh, diversified here in the United States and different groups of people have had their own, sort of power centers more or less, they realize, okay, we can't just have this sort of white supremacist kind of modus operandi. We have to like be more inclusive, but really it's all for that aim of elitism, right? By the elect chosen few.
I've heard Dominionism described that way. Have you heard of Dominionism? I didn't know that that was like the same philosophy with Calvinism. I knew Calvinism had like the work ethic thing,
Mm,
and I just didn't. So yeah, and that right, the Dominionism, and I believe I have heard that Ted Cruz came from a Dominionist background, and they feel like your success is a sign of your being favored by God, which is definitely not a Catholic concept at all. Like it's the
mm.
opposite in Catholicism. So I can see how it wouldn't work. You
Yeah,
do. I think Opus Dei might start trying to inject that into Catholicism, where you're going to have a way more powerful and influential group if you allow them to pursue earthly success. And it undermines you, like the whole Christianity, Catholicism, or Jesus's message will definitely undermine any worldly aspirations that a group has because
mm.
they don't aspire to it.
Right. Well, you're onto something because what I just found, and I didn't know this off the top of my head, but Dominion theology is applying Christian biblical perspective to politics. So it doesn't have a denominational skew. It really just
Interesting.
anybody who takes their biblical belief and applies it politically. And the Calvinists certainly did that. I mean, New Haven started not as a city but as a colony, and this colony was built with the ideal of a utopia under God. And this utopia would be managed by a group of clergymen. So essentially, we're talking about what is it? A government run by priests. I don't know the proper term for that,
Right. Well, it's a
but they
haven. Was that why they named it that? A haven? A haven is a safe harbor. A
mm,
haven is
right.
a place of shelter.
Well, and that's
So
exactly how
interesting.
they felt, when they were exiled, so to speak, from England and other places in Europe. The Protestants came here to, escape the wrath of God that they saw coming to the sort of sinning Anglican church in England, right? So they felt like they were exiling themselves, getting out of the way. They knew the old world was going to crumble. So they said, let's get out of there. God's going to punish those people and we'll start our own thing over here. So yeah, New Haven was not coincidental. Not to mention the like harbor where New Haven's actually positioned is very suitable for shipping. So there's big oil tankers that still to this day go in and out of New Haven Harbor. So yeah, it definitely is a safe harbor, a safe
Mm.
haven, and even the geology of New Haven is interesting because in their minds, the Bible, the Protestant settlers, the Puritans, as they were called, the Bible was pretty much all they were educated with. So in their mind, they had all these biblical scenes going on. So when they saw East Rock looming over this alluvial bay where two rivers form right at the water line. I mean, this is straight out of the Bible, where I don't know exactly what part of the Bible, but I think Ezekiel or somebody is shown a vision of like what a city looks like,
Yes.
God's, holy city. And he's like, this is what it looks like, and there's like a dome on the rock, and there's the rivers going to the shore, and this city right in between the two rivers. And that's exactly how New Haven is created, in between two rivers, with this mountain kind of over, not too far in the distance. And to this day, now they have a soldiers and sailors monument with the Lady of Peace on top of this East Rock Mountain. So, this is all uh, ingrained in the story of New Haven's colony. They certainly were living out this sort of biblical role play, right? In a sense, like we would call it like a role playing game in a way. I don't think they would appreciate that, but I mean, we could think of it that way because obviously the world didn't end in 1600s, and that's
Right.
what they really thought that, that was part of the worldview. And another thing that's kind of deeply sad is that they saw the Native Americans as Babylonians, right? The Indians were not considered like rightful owners of their own land. They were considered like these like fallen people who had escaped the flood somehow and were not worthy of living. They were like exiles themselves, right? Go
I
ahead.
have to say, every atrocity that was ever committed by so-called Christians against other people, whether it's colonizing, it's indigenous people, it's slavery, even I would bring it forward to abortion. They start with the notion that the person that they're oppressing is not actually a person, doesn't have a soul, and is standing in the way of progress for the people who have more value. And it always disturbs me because I see the reflection of the exact same language that they use with the
Right.
abortion thing, and people will say, "Well, they didn't have an appreciation for in the slave times, colonial times, they didn't really know. They really thought that those people didn't have souls." But then I did stumble upon some contemporary writings from the time that basically say that's complete bullshit. You know what you're doing. It's just an excuse. And I've always found that reprehensible.
Well,
The stealing land from people and acting
mm,
like you believe the 10 commandments is just it's
yeah.
unacceptable.
I agree, and that's a big motivation for me, zooming out a little bit because people are like, "How does this connect to Skull and Bones?" So,
No,
like
I love the
where
big picture. I just
yeah,
love it. And it does remind me of Michael Wan, who I know you're friends with.
Mike's the best.
Yeah.
Yeah, he definitely inspired this in a big way. Um, but yeah, I think there is a deep, deep reason why New Haven became the seat of Yale, and then Skull and Bones invades Yale in this very interesting way, almost taking over the school and really changing the course of history. I mean, World War One and World War Two, our involvement as Americans, it really wasn't accidental that we got involved. We were involved from the beginning. The arms companies in the United States, even specifically in Connecticut, were selling guns to both sides, Russia, Germany. I mean, all these nations,
Oh
they were
my
selling
gosh.
ammunition, weapons. So, you know, this is sort of coming from people who have very religious extremist views. We don't think of them as religious extremists because we're exposed to Christianity to the point where it's almost confusing. I mean, we're both Catholics. I grew up Catholic, and I never really paid attention in church, and I almost felt like that was purposeful. Like they were like boring us out of becoming interested because the
Interesting, yeah.
Vatican has
Like
so many
school.
weird secrets. Yeah, they don't want you to be interested. They only want the people who are like, you know, I'm not even going to say what I was about to say, but anyway, they have this like really interesting perspective on the future that is totally, constructed out of theology. And I think this is really dangerous. And to be super clear, I also think that this scientific materialist worldview is it's kind of in the same vein. So, I'm not arguing for either side here. I'm not some kind of, sneaky atheist who's trying to argue against religion, but I'm also not like a fundamentalist anything who's trying to argue against like my enemy religion either, right? So that's
It's
important to maybe say.
Yeah, I find him, I always give, Tolstoy a shout out when something like this comes up
Mm.
because he was a spiritualist anarchist who
Do you know
said
he was
that
buried in
is it
New Haven, or his
Tolstoy?
I
Is
think his son is
it's
buried in
possible.
New
Oh,
Haven. He
really? Well, I'll
moved
have
to
to
New Haven and was buried in New Haven. Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it
No,
was
that's interesting that it would come up. But what Tolstoy's conclusion was that Christ's message is completely antithetical to the way the nation states are set up, the way government's set up, the way war is set up, and he just couldn't anybody who's a true Christian could not abide the the way that European politics were arranged. And furthermore, he he kept going back and forth like, is there a God? Is there not a God? Like, it seems so obvious there's a God to me sometimes, and then it seems so obvious that there's no God. And he ended up landing on there is a God. And if I recall correctly, I used to read a lot about him, but it's been a while. He gave up literature like fiction writing, although it was spiritual and a fantastic way to deliver a message that was interesting and it was engaging. To your point about just like listening to some droning or whatever, but he then just focused on spiritual writing and the literary world was annoyed. But of course, if you really believe, then you're really going to want to dedicate your life to it. You're really going to want to be honest, and you're not actually going to use it as a way to justify your own position. Like Updike would say, it's convincing a man something's true when his paycheck depends on it being not true
Mm,
is impossible. So you
mm,
have to, if you really believe in a God, you have to liberate yourself from that connection. And so that's why I feel like this materialism
mm.
has
Well,
to be a corruption of religion or true Christianity. What you're talking about, like that's the opposite, in my opinion.
absolutely, and what's really interesting is Yale is kind of a kind of nexus point for these ideas, but because funny enough, I was just speaking with Dr. Joseph Farrell, who you may be familiar with. And he's a living legend of an author. He's written like more books than anyone else in the conspiracy world. I was just talking to him yesterday, and the way he described Calvinism when I brought this subject up was Christianity without Christ. So it definitely makes sense that this materialistic, scientific materialism, atheism would make its way into the Ivy League from New England. Keep in mind, most of the Ivy League schools are in New England, aside from like the ones in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. It's not really considered in New York.
Oh
They're not
yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
considered New England. It's more mid Atlantic. But we're gonna circle back. We're gonna wrap a few things up. So it was his second son,
Yeah, I see that.
Elon
Yeah.
Tolstoy, who was buried in New Haven. It's interesting because there's this whole little community called Little Russia that I stumbled upon one day driving around Connecticut, and turns out he was a part of founding that. So very
Yeah.
interesting. He was a writer himself, so he kind of carried that lineage into New Haven's history. And New Haven has just this who's of burials. I mean, if you're into graveyards and stuff, like I'm not particularly into graveyards. I'm more approaching this from the history perspective, but everybody who's left their mark on American history. I mean, there is so many people that have either been to New Haven or were buried in New Haven. I mean, it's really an important place in American histories. But
But you are sensing energy there. You opened with that.
yeah, well,
So,
let's
I mean,
go
could
back to where I
contribute.
opened because I do want to kind of answer your question, like how did I get interested in all
Yes,
this?
yes.
So I was a student at Gateway. I really became more interested in learning from my surroundings than from my classes. I had like one or two classes that I was interested in, and they're both related to things I'm doing now, anthropology and art history. So I was taking those kind of things I was learning and carrying them into my little walkabouts through New Haven. And I'm a stoner, so I would always just look for a good place to light up and hang out and maybe read a book for a few, 30 minutes, an hour in between classes. And one day I'm sitting at the Green, this historic place that I really had no knowledge of, and run into a gentleman named Amos, who, I didn't know him from Adam, but he saw that I wore a shirt that had Sitting Bull on it, and he recognized Sitting Bull, and he's like, "Oh, you know about Sitting Bull? What do you know about Sitting Bull?" And he told me he's a Native American, so we kind of got into this conversation that evolved into a friendship. And I asked him why he moved from Arizona to New Haven of all places, because I mean, other than Yale University, is really nothing to offer in Yale unless you're like
Right.
one of these like Ivy League people. You really have no place there.
And it's
Uh,
high crime for people outside the gates.
Oh, and not even outside the gates, right there in the center green. I mean, you could see everything from overdoses to
Mm.
drunkards fighting. I mean, it's definitely. And then there's like guys in like, $5,000 suits walking by, like,
Yeah,
whoa,
definitely.
So yeah, it is a weird kind of mixing melting pot. But yeah, so Amos and I kind of hit it off, and he moved to New Haven because in the early 1900s, Prescott Bush went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and desecrated the grave of Geronimo by digging up his
Oh,
body,
yes.
taking his thigh bones and his skull,
Oh, that
and
makes me wanna
bringing.
throw up.
Well, yeah, and imagine hearing this, like, as a kid who, I'm only 18 at the time. I knew about conspiracy theories from the internet, but I had never been, like, faced with one, like, from a person who's like, "Hey, this happened right around the corner." So, he takes me to the tomb, and it's on High Street. You could drive by it, you can walk by it, and this is really, creepy kind of Egyptian-looking building where they have Geronimo's skull and many others. And like I said, it got there through Prescott Bush, the grandfather of the most recent Bush president and the father of President Bush Sr., HW.
Do you think that's undisputed?
So there's a couple different things that with this case, because, for the one, the Native Americans who are related to Geronimo say this, okay? And there's a couple of reasons why I believe it. For one, the grave site of Geronimo after the you know burial, I think 40 years after the burial, after his body would have been taken by Prescott Bush, they placed like this cement kind of I don't know what to call it, foundation over his grave, and then put like this monument, this stone
Yeah, I'm
monument.
looking at it, yeah.
It looks like other stone pyramids that are built by Rosicrucians,
Oh,
specifically
yeah.
in Pennsylvania. You have some that are, like the James Buchanan Monument. I mean, it looks almost just like the Buchanan Monument, and it has a imperial eagle on top of it, of all things. Which I don't think Geronimo's like symbol was an eagle. I mean, his name doesn't
Right.
have anything to do with an eagle, so I don't understand why they put that there. But you know, the Skull and Bones folks have been approached by several different people. There was a gentleman who tried to like uh, go to Yale and raise a big stink about it. I think it was while Obama was president, and he tried to like sue basically the presidency for not kind of prosecuting this, because there's a whole federal law protecting grave goods, the Native American Repatriation Act. So this is like a federal matter. I don't know the exact specifics to this case, but I think the gist of it was, it got back to Bush, who said, oh, well, we don't have anything to do with that, But there have been several attempts by different groups of Native Americans to approach Yale and get the skull back. In the 50s, they approached Yale, and Yale gave them, instead of Geronimo's skull, they gave them a child's skull, like a very small skull. That
That's scary.
really, yeah, which is scary. And it's also very like rude. I don't know.
Right.
It's like, you're like here for your ancestor and they give you somebody else's corpse. It's like, what? Like, you
Right, and they
idiot?
thought, like, it would be more plausible if it was tiny. Can I
Yeah,
just read this little
please.
line out of the Wikipedia entry for the Russell Trust, which you haven't gotten to yet, but I think it's maybe even synonymous at one point, or it's the legal entity that is
Mhm.
Skull and Bones, but it says and you might have been getting to this, but it's important if they're to show that they are protected in some regards. In 1943, by special act of the Connecticut State Legislature, its trustees were granted an exemption from filing corporate reports with the Secretary of State, normally being a requirement. So it's a trust that should have filings with the government, and they're exempted from it. And it doesn't say that that was ever rescinded. It also says that Prescott Bush was one of the founders of the Russell Trust.
Mm. Yeah. So when you consider Yale's age, it starts to make sense why they have such a sway with the Connecticut government. And the Russell Trust Association is pretty much just the corporation behind Skull and Bones, because once a member becomes initiated, they're known as a knight. And then once they graduate Yale, they're known as a patriarch, and they remain a member of the order for their entire life. So it's important for them to have like a legal body. I mean, most fraternities have a sort of like LLC or something that they use to keep the finances above board. But yeah, that's exactly what's going on with Russell Trust. Is they have this sort of you know a lot of leeway with financial institution when you consider the companies that have big headquarters or places in New Haven: Bank of America, Key Bank, you know uh, Merrill Lynch. There's a couple others that aren't coming to mind immediately, but yeah, it's definitely sewn up. Yale 1717 was when it was founded, and well, at least that's when the school was built in New Haven. It was founded in 1701, and they kind of they hopscotched from town to town until they eventually settled in New Haven. If it wasn't for Yale, I mean, New Haven would just be another like shitty coastal
Yeah,
city. I mean, really,
yeah,
not to shade New Haven, but in the 50s, it was like a slum except for Yale. So
right.
but I'm kind of jumping all over the place. So back to Amos. He kind of fills me in on this story with Geronimo, and it just really stuck with me because I've always been interested in Native American culture, and I've always felt like a connection to nature, and there's just this sort of symmetry there between the three. So I felt like it was right for me to understand this stuff. And also being someone born on this land, I feel like we owe that these ancestors of our land, that like I don't know, explanation in a way, like figuring out their story. We owe it to them. So it was
Yeah, I mean,
part of what,
crimes were committed.
right. Oh,
You know,
terrible
they're
crime.
unsolved crimes. Yeah, we have an obligation as a self-proclaimed lawful society
Mm,
to at least, bring justice, even if it's just to correct the record.
yeah. Well, and New Haven is historically like considered a friend, like when the Puritans moved into New Haven, the Quinnipiac who lived in the area were victim to the Pequot and the Mohawk, right? The Pequot and the Mohawk were other tribes that would go on raids. So of course the Quinnipiac were like, yeah, you guys have like silver and guns and all this stuff. Like, yeah, come hang out with us, live here, build here. You're good. Like, we love you. Be our friends. So, it wasn't always this sort of, oh, we're going to enslave everybody. But obviously as time went on, and people began to colonize and expand, the Native Americans got pushed out or they got taken as slaves. And that part of history really isn't recorded as much because uh, they were just called Negroes at that point, which is really kind of sad that, they all got lumped together, Africans, indigenous. And given that a lot of African voyages took place pre Columbus, you have to wonder if the Native Americans were maybe connected to Africa
Oh,
to begin with.
yes, I don't know
So
if you've ever heard me talk to, Noble. I mean, I just love him. He hosts the CFR Network, which is kind of a joke, but it's about, like, faith and righteousness. I forget what the C stands for, but he's just an awesome dude, and he lives in Birmingham, England, but he's of West Indian descent, and he has some very deep ideas about the African migration and even slavery, the slave trade. He thinks
I would love
that
to
this
talk to him.
there's a yeah, there was a lot of he personally thinks that there were more Native Americans as slaves than Africans,
Right.
and there was a lot of mixing. So I was unaware of that history, but he would be the guy to talk to. He's recommended some books, but I do have 1,000 books now, and I
Mm.
don't know whether to put the new ones on the top of the pile or at the bottom of the pile. But he's just super interesting because he's so open-minded and his culture is from there, his
Mm.
family is from there, and,
Yeah, please,
I adore him. So you might wanna talk to him.
please connect me with him. Yeah, and
Absolutely, yes, will do.
I bring this up not just to say that, like, okay, so, this random Native American guy told me about Geronimo, big deal. Well, there's a really deep story here. I mean, I mentioned I have a sort of empathy for that to begin with. My father's best friend actually as a kid is a Native American person. So they're not like totally gone, there's still Native Americans here in Connecticut.
But they want to erase all the cultural impact
Right.
by not letting us name I mean, what could they won't actually say, "Well, they're named the Braves, and that's not fi" it's like, when you name your warriors after a culture like that, that you might we think of as, like, the rhetoric of saying that they're primitive or whatever, but still, they're what you aspire to in your warriors and your football teams and that kinda thing to I don't care whether it sounds like a pejorative name or not, it is it is, I think, an homage, and I think
Oh
by
yeah.
erasing by saying you can't call them the Indians, I mean, and
Well,
I just that just drives me crazy.
yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, so many sports were, based on like Native American games. I mean, lacrosse and all these other sports. Hockey was also kind of informed by Native American culture. So yeah, to begin with, and Native Americans in a time were some of the best athletes in sports. So yeah, it is interesting to
Yeah, and
see how
they
it's
you do
changed.
the NAACP, I mean, you're not gonna some groups decide not to rewrite history, to whitewash it, and still to keep the continuity of, um, that cultural hat tip, at least for the Indians, so that just bothers
Get
me,
this
and I feel
though.
like they wanna erase them. Say it again?
Get this though, because you're absolutely right. And New Haven, although starting off seemingly friendly to the Quinnipiac, eventually, by the time Yale was founded, they were trading slaves in ports like New Haven, and the green was regularly used to hang slaves. Not to
Oof.
mention, and again, when I use that word slave, we're not just talking about people who were taken from Africa. We're talking about people who were born in America as indigenous people. So, yeah, it's very tragic. There are over 6,000 bodies buried under the New Haven Green to this day. And all of that space is, just grass. Like you can walk over it. You can,
Wow.
just homeless people sleep on top of, ancient graves, so to speak. So, yeah, the history of New Haven is complicated. And I did not understand all that as I was sitting there, 10 years ago. And as time went on, I dropped out of college and I got a job as a delivery guy, which led to another job as a delivery guy, which led to me being a bakery delivery driver within New Haven. And I had all of these, clients that were within Yale. So I would be delivering baked goods to like, Yale School of Economics, Yale School of Business, Yale Science Department. So I was all up in the college campus for like 3 or 4 years as a delivery guy. And some really weird synchronicities happened. And this was all before I started podcasting. I've always been reading these books and listening to stuff like this, but I never really realized like, oh, I have a place in this. I mean, the name of my show, my family thinks I'm crazy. My friends thought I was crazy too, because all I do is talk about this kind of stuff. Until I had the outlet of podcasting, it really, fell on deaf ears. But all of that to say that there are these like glaring synchronicities, and one of them that just I can't forget. Every Tuesday, I would deliver to the Yale School of Economics. It's a classroom built out of an old house. Okay. And you see a lot of this kind of stuff because architecture is important in New Haven. So they like to preserve a lot of these colonial older mansions and whatnot. So this mansion is the School of Economics, and I would go there pretty early in the morning, and the only person there was a janitor, and there's the same janitor every time, and he got frustrated with me knocking on the door because he's vacuuming, he can't hear me. So one day he teaches me how to like essentially break into this mansion, right? I jump over a wall. He said, put your pastries on the front step, jump over this wall, walk through here, and this door is never locked. So I'm like, okay, cool, a door that's never locked, that's interesting. So I go in and I do my thing. And so every Tuesday I had this weird little routine of jumping a wall, going into this building. And one Tuesday I walk in, I do my thing. I look down at the Yale newspaper and it says, on this day, George H.W. Bush passes away, former resident of New Haven, 88 Hill House Avenue. And I'm like, holy crap, I'm at 88 Hill House Avenue. This is the house that I'm in right now. George H.W. Bush lived here. George W. Bush was a kid living in this house that I've been, jumping over the wall and getting into to deliver these pastries every Tuesday. So that kind of just smacked me on the head. And I realized, like, don't let what Amos told you go to waste. Like, this is a guy who shared truth with you, carry that truth forward into the world. And I've tried to do that as best as I can with this research that only became a bit available to me after like taking the risk and quitting my job and starting this podcast, right? Because when I was
Right.
a delivery guy working for Amazon, after I quit my job at the bakery, I started working at Amazon. And I was doing like 10-hour shifts, 5 days a week. I had no time to do any of this kind of research, but I had plenty of time to listen to podcasts. And that's when, all these things started aligning. And, sure enough, I start working for Sam Tripoli, and that kind of helped grease the wheels to meet really cool folks like yourself. And,
And
and
you have a great podcast. It's very popular. It seems to have a lot very high ratings,
thank you.
and I really love your style. You're very good at it. I don't. I think there are a lot of podcasts out there, and I'm my style, like, to interview, I just wanna have a conversation because it's for my own amusement, but but that's not what you do. You give people the time and space to explore their ideas, and it's just you have very nice pace and sound of your voice. I really, really love your podcast, so you were definitely, answered a call.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah. And, it was funny because one of the things I realized after I dropped out of school was I was becoming this autodidactic, and not only like I was kind of gaming the system because I realized I had a job at a Chinese food delivery place like straight out of college, dropping out, and and I would just read books in between my jobs because I had like a weird shift from like noon to like 10 p.m. and I worked like 5 days a week, so it was a great job. Like I just sat there in this little restaurant and read my books, went out and did deliveries, smoked a little pot on my way back from delivering the food, and just kept going, and realized like, okay, if I do this right, I can actually like educate myself and get paid to do it. So I kept getting jobs like that where I had space to do that. And then, reading on the job became like people were like, "Why are you bringing books to work? Like, you're not here to read, you're here to work." So then I luckily found podcasts, and that's when I was like, "Okay, cool. I can just stick a headphone in my ear and I'm good. I'm learning all this stuff." So, yeah, I definitely feel like I went to school for podcasting in a way, like listening to shows for like 5 or 6 years kind of helped me see what I liked about podcasting and what I didn't like.
And you did it, this is why I like your show, because you did it, obviously, from what you're saying, to learn,
Mm,
and there are a lot of, even in radio, when I was in radio, I had to come to terms with the fact that it's a lot of people are listening to pass the time, are listening to be entertained. And so if you listen to radio and it sounds like they're giving you information, a lot of it is just trying to tap into your emotions. That's why it's caller driven. And, there's just stuff I learned along the
mm.
way. And then I discovered that the only podcasts I really like to listen to are informative. And the ones that are trying to rile you up, the ones that are drawing big conclusions, that kind of derails me from thinking through things myself. But real, like, information, firsthand research, that's what I love about it. It just feels like it's depositing information directly into my brain when I really don't have time to just read and I can do something else. And what I do a lot of housework. Like, I don't need to think, but I can't sit down and read. And it's just a great combo. And it's a secret way of learning. And they want to keep you busy in these blue collar jobs, but you can make the most of it.
I really recommend people do that. I guarantee there's probably like 25 to 50% of the audience already doing that, and bravo to them. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think what was also really good about that was driving keeps one part of your brain like doing a task, whereas like now I'm sitting at my desk and listening to podcasts. I'm not retaining as much as when I was driving. It would all just kind of subconsciously fill in. And now I just make time to go for random drives just to get that feeling because there's really something about that. And it doesn't have to be driving, it could be washing the dishes or chores, whatever. If you
Ironing is a good one.
yeah, keep yourself busy
And
while
then
you're listening.
that's how I like to do this. Just normally, I just am so sick of cleaning the kitchen. You would not believe how many times I've cleaned the kitchen. Many times a day. I know, I get people then say to me, like, "Why don't you have your kids do it? Why do you make, like, a different meal for every kid?" Whatever, I got problems, but I do a lot of dishes, and I let them pile up so that I can, just listen to a whole
Mm.
podcast, and
You're like, you look
it's
at the pile
it's
of dishes,
great.
you're like, that's a 30-minute podcast right
Yeah,
there.
yeah, but it's like, why do you let this stuff build up? It's like, "Because I got a plan."
I love that. So, yeah, and to rope it all back in, I had these sort of synchronicities like the one I just described with George H.W. Bush's house. And I realized like, okay, there's a subconscious process going on. I'm integrating all this information into my mind. It's going somewhere. For whatever reason, I've always been kind of skilled at listening to something and then like communicating that to others. And for the longest time, nobody gave a shit, to be honest. So that's where the name of the show comes from, really. But with Skull and Bones, it's kind of an interesting story. When I was a Chinese food delivery guy, a buddy of mine, one of the only people I knew that even talked about conspiracy theories at that time, 2011, 2010, we were both like talking about loose change and inside jobs and things like that. He comes into the Chinese food delivery place and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing with your life these days? You should come by to this fraternity I'm a part of." And I'm like, "Dude, I don't go to school." And he's like, "Neither do I." He's like, "I'm a part of this fraternity." And he's like, "It's fun. We drink, smoke pot." So I'm like, okay, I'm not really a party scene kind of dude. I'm sitting here reading books. I mean, like, think about it, right? I'm I'm a total nerd in a way, but I wanted to experience that college kind of life because the community college I went to had none of that. It was just very like high school 2.0. So I go in, I check it out, and end up being really fun. And I got initiated into this like basically fraternity, like Delta Kappa Epsilon, Beta Kappa, one of these types, right? Like a lettered fraternity. And the weird thing about this fraternity is it wasn't associated with the school anymore because of some incident they had with another fraternity. But the guys were so, motivated they kept it going, and they even allowed like people who weren't a part of the school to be a part of it. So this kind of underground thing, and there is this aspect to it that vaguely connected to Skull and Bones because they had a Jolly Roger flag in their window. And I remember asking a brother, like, hey, I know where that's from. Like, why do you guys have that? Like, I know what that's about. And they told me this story about how, older class, probably 5 years before I was there, they had the challenge of scavenger hunt. This is one of the things that all fraternities make their pledges do, go out and steal a bunch of stuff. And Skull and Bones is actually famous for it. They call it crooking, right? And amongst the Yaleys, they're kind of known for doing this. They'll go and they'll like steal some kind of trophy, or they'll steal someone's license plate. They'll even steal Geronimo's skull from his grave. I mean, I think that's where the tradition started. But this fraternity that I was in took part in this kind of crooking tradition. And one of the things that they crooked was this flag. And they said that they took it from Skull and Bones. And I said, how did you take it from Skull and Bones? They don't have a flagpole. I've been to their tomb. Well, come to find out, they don't sleep in that dusty old building. They have a fraternity house set aside for certain members of Skull and Bones who want to live on, in that kind of housing situation. And they had a flag on their porch that the guys in the fraternity I was a part of stole. So here's this kind of weird, interlope between what I was learning about to then what I got involved with. And outside of that one incident and maybe one or two other smaller things, there really wasn't like a conspiratorial aspect to this fraternity. It was cool that they were like, underground, because it was like no rules kind of. But in that environment, they had to have more rules because the you know eyes were on them more, being like this party house off campus that the cops would get called on. So it was weird, like, being in a fraternity, you have this reputation of, like, not respecting women and all this stuff, and that was totally the opposite, right? With this place, the guys were all, like, about, like, "Oh, we have sober guardians of every party to make sure nobody gets, hurt or taken advantage of." So that was my job a lot of parties. I would I couldn't drink. I would be able to smoke a little bit of pot, but they really didn't want me to do that either. And you would just hang out at the party in one room and just keep watch, to make sure nobody's getting hurt. And that was kind of the environment that I went, and kind of became a young adult through, like this weird, like, underbelly.
I've never heard of anything like that, but were the other members of this fraternity mostly Yale students or mostly college students or not even college anymore?
Oh, so there was, in the history of the fraternity, a couple of students that joined who were Yale, which was odd. But no, for the most part, this was a state Connecticut university. So this is in the same town as New Haven, but a different college. So there weren't any Ivy League people, but it was all, yeah, it was all Southern Connecticut State University folks, and a couple from like towns that were like close by who like knew about it from their friends, like me. Like I was from out of town. So I didn't really I fit in a bit because I'm a likable guy, but I definitely felt like an outsider even there. And it was cool to experience that. And, a lot of synchronicities actually from that led to me working at that bakery. My friend that I made in the fraternity was the manager at the bakery that hired me to go and deliver throughout Yale. So yeah, it's just, one thing that leads to another. I know we meant to talk about Skull and Bones, and now I'm kind of doing like a Tony Robbins thing now. I think people
It's
really
fine.
I think people really should, like, if they could glean anything from what I just said, like, glean the fact that you don't need to rely on authority. I always had this anxiety about authority in my life, and not in like a super rebellious way, because I recognized, like being rebellious could actually compromise you more than it could like free you. So I've been like careful about my rebelliousness, and I think people should take calculated steps to free themselves from this system. And maybe you can kind of glimpse a little bit of that from what I've just talked about.
Have you ever heard of or read How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World by Harry Brown?
Huh, no, but I'll write
Oh,
that down.
He's the best, and it's one of those things where the first time I've mentioned it on the air was whatever, $12 at thrift books, and then the last time I looked, it was like $300. Like, they just I don't
Oh,
know why these great books disappear, but Harry Browne was a great libertarian,
mm,
and he was, I remember when I was first dating my husband, Harry Browne was running for president. He died, of course, untimely, in my opinion, but he was a libertarian running for president. And my husband, well, at the time, it was just my boyfriend, barely. And he said, "Who are you voting for?" And I said, "Harry Browne." And he said, "Who?" And I said, "Harry Browne, the libertarian." And he said, "The what?" So that's how long ago it was. But Harry Browne was great. And he was, I love the one quote, if I can do it correctly, of his was, he said, "Libertarians must never define themselves in terms of liberal or conservative. We are not fiscal conservatives and social liberals. We believe in individual liberty and personal responsibility on all issues at all times." And his book, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World, it really kind of put me off at the beginning, because he's saying if you're in jail, you're not free. So don't go to jail. Like, use your silver bullets wisely. Like, carve yourself out a life that you can enjoy. I do run up against the challenge of, if you do you not owe a duty to your children to try to kick the can of tyranny, or a debt to your ancestors who did the same? Like, my family's highly, really into liberty. I was raised as a libertarian, whether they called it that or not. I was
mm,
raised to have like limited government, all that, freedom, moral compass, everything. So it's a classic. He's the best. And
mm,
but I agree with you for the most part. And actually, it's a major white pill to think that way, because if you start your day thinking you have to change the world, or be this brick wall between your kids and tyranny, you're defeated at the get-go. But you can look back, I'm sure there were plenty of people who lived under the Roman times who had miserable lives. Like, you still there. I don't know if the world's going to change now that they have the technology to totally enslave us. However, I got one life. I can't worry about somebody else's life that's in the future. I'm going to do my part. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to carve out my cocktail time and, like, pet my dog and just try to have that bit of freedom and joy.
mm. Well, it's like the pen is mightier than the sword, but both the pen and the sword are technology. So, what are we really looking at? We're looking at the human expression through tools. And I think if we look at what kind of tools are being created, overwhelmingly, they're tools of destruction and death. So, yeah, until we can get outside of that, we're definitely, yeah, looking at a bleak future, possibly. I don't like to think that way, but when you look at the facts, and I know people who might see the title, if you title it Skull and Bones, they're going to be like, all right, get to the facts. So I'm going to do that right now, because we're talking about the Native Americans, and this is incredibly important. America has always been at war, even before the revolution, and New Haven was actually the site of never really any battles, but definitely a think tank of war. The first Indian Wars, okay? They weren't called the first Indian Wars by a lot of authors, but they are the first Indian Wars. They started in New England, and one of them is called King Philip's War. And you see this, glancing through history, you're probably thinking King Philip, who, maybe he's some Dutch guy or maybe he's some Spanish guy. No, King Philip was what the New Englanders called a chief. Uh, I don't want to mispronounce his name. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I think it's Matabasic, but I'm going to just go with Matabasic since I don't remember his name. But either way, he was a Native American who basically said, we've had enough. These colonists have taken more than they've given. They've broken their promises, and we Indians are going to get together and we're going to fight back. And obviously England, France, Spain, Dutch, they were already in it, in New England and in this area. So they had, trading going on with various tribes. So the Mohawk, they were like, all right, we're friends with the British, we fight with the British. And everybody was afraid of the Mohawks for the most part. I mean, the Mohawks had no allies in like this part of New England. So, that was an alliance that kind of tore things up. Then we have the Mohegans, not the same as the Mohicans that what's his name wrote a film.
Really?
Yeah, that there's a very famous author who actually lived in New Haven, Fenimore Cooper, who's a Yale graduate, who wrote the book The Last of the Mohicans that
Great.
became the Kevin Costner film. The Mohegans, they're actually not connected to them, but they're similar names. So maybe in the ancient past they had a similar ancestor. But the Mohegans, they aligned with the British as well down here in Connecticut. So you have some tribes that benefited from this war, but for the most part, even the tribes that were on the winning side ended up losing in the long run, right? Because what do we see happen? Uh, all of the allies of the colonists during this Great Indian War, if they weren't fighting, they were basically put in internment camps on an island in the Boston Harbor, which, if you've ever been in Boston in the winter, you don't want to go island hopping, right? So these poor souls were left to basically freeze to death on an island while, women and children, right? While the men were fighting alongside either the colonists or this group of patriots, the first patriots in American history, the Native Americans, the patriots.
Right.
Because I mean, think about it. They were fighting for their land the same way this rhetoric has been spun against the British, which rightly so to a certain extent. The Native Americans were the first patriots, and it all started in these Great Indian Wars, which, for the most part, had an economic value for the European powers, right? They could profit off of war. They could sell, guns or whatever to one tribe and trade with another tribe. So they kind of just use these tribes and pit them against each other. And yeah, even the winners, like I said, became losers in the long run because they all eventually became sort of victims to the federal government and left on these reservations with, for the most part, a variety of problems. I mean, some are better off than others, but for the most part, it's a problematic situation that began here in New England with the visionaries of Yale, because the first 10 ministers that formed Yale University were Harvard graduates who also formed the Stockbridge Indian Missionary School in Massachusetts. So, Stockbridge, Massachusetts was this sort of proving ground for this art of the missionary. And anybody who studies military history knows that a missionary is essentially a spy, essentially a scout, an information gatherer, right? So you can
Yes.
send your missionaries out, they gather information, they gather up troops, because if they're successful at their job as a missionary, then they're kind of indoctrinating people, right?
I have to say, I was researching Operation Gladio, which came from research I was doing on the Vatican Bank and the scandals in that. And one thing I came upon was just in passing, just talking about the structure of the orders, of the different orders, and how they plug into the Vatican. So there's different orders, and then there's one, I think Opus Dei goes right directly to the Pope. It's the one that's like a personal prelate of the Pope or something like that. But I'm not sure it's everyone, but my uncle was a Franciscan priest, and this seems consistent with their style. They all report up. So every single person just reports, a person in the order reports up to their senior, their superior, their particular superior, and just goes up like that. And that's just how it works. So the Franciscan, he took a vow of poverty, obedience, and chastity. So he took a vow of obedience, and he would just do what they told him to do, and he would definitely tell them what was going on. And so I realized, my mother's a devotee of Father Walter Sizak, who was, I think he might have been in the in the gulag or whatever for something like 27 years. Like, I think he was, I can't even get my mind around that. I'd have to double check that, but he was imprisoned in Russia by the communists as a spy for decades. And she prays to him, like she attributes miracles to him. And the way I always thought about it was that these guys were absolutely just imprisoned because the Soviet Union hated religion. However, then I realized, I mean, I'm not saying that's not true, but what I realized was, I just said this the other day. I was like, well, but they were spies. They were spies, whether they meant to be or not. They were the only ones left on the ground behind the Iron Curtain who would had a higher dedication, and they would pass that information up, I would say, absolutely innocently, absolutely, or beyond that, just to try to give sustenance to people in the faith on the ground there, so it would maybe even be two-way communication.
Mm.
So, and I think that if you want it, there's probably a rabbit hole around Pope John Paul II
Oh,
also, because he was Polish. He was the first Polish pope by far, and for sure. And that was around the fall, when Poland had the solidarity and the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union. And I just started to think, like, now that you mention that, I never thought of it of missionaries. This is just like a new idea, but I think that's like has to be true, and which is why churches and states can be such enemies, because they're competing for a power base. And then when the Catholic Church was kind of driven out of Europe, or they started having uh the kings absorb, or like Henry VIII or whatever, absorb the power of the church. The kings would take the land from the church, and they would do all these things. But you can see that there's a tension between the church, even as an earthly presence, and the political authority that they were working against, whether it's missionaries in a foreign country that had what we might consider primitive or call primitive, whatever. It's definitely a political threat.
yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you expanded on that because it's definitely, you know, all of what we are seeing on the political stage after, I mean, even after the Civil War, but let's just go World War I, uh, is maybe, if not directly, slightly, uh, subtly manipulated by aspects of Skull and Bones, right? Whether directly through members or by policy set forth by members or even just ideology distributed by these folks, right? And a lot of these ideas connect to, the German Illuminati, Adam Weishaupt, the University of Berlin, figures like George Hegel, these ideas about the state being superior to man, and that we need to create a state that people worship like God, right? I mean, these are all sort of in this same milieu of progressivism, Calvinism, things that really fit hand in glove when they, you know, inseminated the Ivy League system through Yale and Harvard. And that's exactly what happened with this Skull and Bones society forming there. Skull and Bones comes into the picture in 1832. It's founded by William Huntington Russell and Alphonso Taft, who is the grandfather of the President Taft. I believe his son was also someone in the presidency, or not a president, but like someone in the federal government, maybe treasurer. And he himself held a position as judge. So, from the onset, really uh, influential people start Skull and Bones, people who were inspired by their recent trip from Germany, where they studied abroad, as these, college students tend to do. They go and do a semester abroad or something. Well, he spent a summer abroad in Germany, sort of taking in lectures from George Hegel before they go and start this Skull and Bones. So some people think that maybe they were initiated into some sort of order in Germany, and that's why when Skull and Bones was broken into by the Order of the File and Claw, which was sort of a tongue-in-cheek way of the Yale student body who were fed up with the secret societies after that like Civil War period of United States history. They were fed up with the secret society politics and the culture of secrecy going on at Yale, so they broke into the tomb, and they found that seems like Skull and Bones is the second chapter of a German organization. They have all this German heraldry above a fireplace, black velvet on the walls, and of course, maybe a catacomb-like crypt at the bottom of the, underground, the basement where they have all these, trophies, these sinister skull trophies. So, yeah, there have been brave folks who've, broken into Skull and Bones, and that even prompted them to expand their tomb. If you go to the tomb today, you'll see that it's like a triptych. You have the doorway in the center and two main bodies of the building. One of those is older than the other. You can kind of tell which one's older, but that whole block is owned by Skull and Bones, and they built the art museum, the Yale Art Museum that is there. They basically sold the property to the people who built the Yale Art Museum, and of course, Skull and Bones at that point in time had probably a president as, not just a president of the United States. They didn't have that yet, but the presidents of Yale, there have been Skull and Bones in that list as well. So they had a lot of influence over the school. And this art museum is a just huge collection of Native American artifacts, Egyptian artifacts, African artifacts of all kinds, Asian artifacts. I mean, to this day, there's dozens of amazing things in there. But at the time, they were gathering a lot of the spoils of this sort of Egyptian craze that was going on. Napoleon had gone down and intellectually conquered Egypt. He defeated the standing army and basically sent his scientists out and to gather as much information as he could. And all of this stuff came back to places like New Haven, and they used these sort of images of what Egypt looked like to create things like the Grove Street Cemetery, and this whole Egyptian style, this facade. And I want to show you a picture if I can share my screen here for a
Can
moment.
you? Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it's really fascinating when you see New Haven from the ground. Um, because it's just like it's it's just breathtaking, some of the occult imagery and
Yes.
symbolism just right in your face.
Do you think that they believe that it has real value? That it
What do you
has,
mean
like,
by that?
spiritual,
Oh,
occult,
okay.
like, magical value? Or do you think that they think it looks like it does?
Well, look at this. Tell me what you see there. You see the dead shall be raised,
Oy
right?
vey. I
You
mean,
see
I think that too, but in a totally different way.
and I know that
Eternal salvation.
I think that comes from actually, the Philistines or
Yeah,
Philippines in the Bible. So this is a biblical.
Palestinians is what
That's
the
what it is.
Philistines are, actually.
Okay. Thank you. I'm not a biblical scholar. I should get more.
No, I think very few people know that. Yes, the Philistines, it's synonymous with basically being uneducated, but it's funny because you can trace that kind of, um, uh, conflict with the Palestinians from for thousands of years, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's why this stuff is so important to your point, or your question. To answer your question, does this occult imagery actually do anything? Is it significant? Is it like potent? I guess is maybe
Yes.
another way to ask that question. I would say yes, because in their minds, they're fulfilling ancient prophecy. So they want to adopt this symbolism of the you know icons that they're worshiping, right? So something like this winged sun disk with the two snakes coming out of the top, like where else do you see that? You only see
Yeah.
that in Egypt. It's clearly not a Christian idea of God there. So, why are they using this at not only a cemetery, but America's first planned cemetery? This is the first cemetery of its kind in America.
Really?
Yep, and some really incredible people are buried here. But yeah, I do think that
Wow.
they're trying to enact this sort of biblical prophecy, and that's why you see the conflicts in the Middle East perpetrated by the Bush government. You know, what I mean, like George H.W. Bush in the CIA. Think about his connections not only to the Middle East with oil and all this, but China as well, as they kind of come in to the frame on the world stage in the past 10, 15, 20 years. More so it was the Middle East in the 90s, and that's when George H.W. Bush was still kind of influencing through Clinton, who actually both
Oh,
Bill and Hillary went to Yale Law School, which is right across the street from this cemetery here. So, yeah, it all
okay,
connects.
so that's very interesting, like, I never really I did once it did occur to me, I wonder if the whole, so much energy going into and coming out of the Middle East is more than just about fossil fuels or whatever, although energy is energy, right? I mean,
Well,
maybe there's more to it, but that so I looked into it, and if you were to put do you ever see something like a little game at Sharper Image or something where it looks like not balanced, but if you put like a pencil right underneath it, it will balance? Apparently, so I looked, what is the geocentric point of the world? Like where if all the land, or I think this was the thing, that if all the people, if somebody lived on every square foot of land in the entire world, the and everybody had to meet in one spot. The spot that would require the least amount of miles traveled would be Egypt. Some people say Atlanta is like another one like that, but it's like a geocentric point of the earth is Egypt. Like there's something about Egypt. So I always wondered if that's why we had so much energy
some
there.
people.
I should tell people because the vast majority of the people who will hear this it'll just be audio, but this video is on rockfin.com/deep dives. It's on my YouTube channel, Monica Perez. I think it's like youtube.com/Monica Perez. It's on Rumble at Monica Perez Show. And it's even live streaming on Twitter and Facebook. So you can find the video anywhere, but most people are just listening to the audio. But what I'm looking at here is that stuff looks like it's from Egypt. Is that correct? Like this statuary is from Egypt in the cemetery, or is it replica, you think?
Well, we know who built it. It was Henry Austin, who was a very prominent architect in New Haven. He's left his fingerprints on New Haven in a big way. But no, not an actual artifact. They do have some things like that, not in New Haven, but the Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park in New York City is actually straight out of Egypt. So it's not unheard of for that to happen. But no, not that I know of outside of documents, because at the rare, and I have another slide I'll show you, at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, they have a copy of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So, which is, very interesting considering that this building is right across the street from that cemetery as well. It's right next to the Yale Law School. If you see in this picture here, that red brick building in the back in the center,
Yes.
that's the Yale Law School. And the manuscript library is really amazing. I mean, these panels that make the walls of the exterior actually allow in just enough light for what you see on the inside there. It sort of glows this like amber color, and that's all natural to keep, the lighting a certain way to not damage the books.
Yes, I love it. As a person with huge library, well, a tiny library compared to that, but like I do worry about that.
Well, they have some pretty, strenuous security measures. There's a argon system that if there's ever a fire in this building, you want to get out of the building immediately because anybody left in the building will suffocate to death. They do this argon thing that
Wow.
sucks the oxygen out, replaces it with argon, and hopefully snuffs out any fire that might occur. So,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, it's a
Save the
very
books, not the people. Wow, that's like a
right.
classic hypothetical. Like if the last copy of Shakespeare, and your baby, like which you, they're
And
like save Shakespeare.
look at this building for a second with a flexible eye. You can't really see the best perspective on it right now, but to me, it looks like a book on its side. Okay, and you can kind of see that with this angle
Yeah.
where it almost looks like a book on its side. And I think syncretically, esoterically, when I'm decoding this building visually, it's a book. It's a giant book, and it's meant to
Yeah.
be sort of like a library of Alexandria almost.
Totally what I was thinking during this
And
whole thing.
right in front of it is the Book and Snake Tomb, which Skull and Bones is not the only secret society at Yale. They have a brother secret society, so to speak, called Book and Snake, and B and S, S and B, right? We're playing with words and numbers and symbols here, so we can see the again this the pattern with Book and Snake, and they have the same thing going on where they're uh, sort of embodying the Nike temple in Greece. I know Greece isn't Egypt, but Egypt has a, very close connection with Greece, right? The
Well,
Greco-Roman Egyptian connection. I mean, that is the center of Western consciousness.
that symbol that you showed, the winged sun disk, frightening
Zoroastrianism,
me is saying is
right?
Zoroastrian. So that's just even more ancient than the middle. So all that I think this
Oh,
is
and
interesting. Like all our religions are Middle Eastern. I think like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all like the European religions, the most popular religions in Europe are all from the Middle East. But Zoroastrianism, I believe, is the oldest, if not like tied for the oldest
well,
religion. And it was the original religion of Iran. So real old school Iranians, they're like, no, the Islamic religion was an invasion. Now, I don't know if that like offends people. I don't want to offend people, but I do think
let's
Zoroastrianism
be really
is
clear. Let's be really clear.
sure. Yeah.
Zoroastrianism is the first monotheistic religion. This is
Got it.
the first
Okay. Okay.
religion that believes in a single God. So, and that's not to say that other religions don't, because that's the kind of thing with this subject is like the pantheistic religions had a central deity above all of the lesser deities as well, typically. So, but all of these ideas come from Egypt, right? Egypt, Sumeria, Babylon. This is the oldest. Iran is essentially Babylon, Sumeria, right? I mean, those cultures were affected by Sumerian, Babylon, Egypt in the same way that the Greco-Roman Egypt world was affected, right? Zoroastrianism is a little more contemporary with what we're talking about here. I mean, I think Zoroastrianism was like around when the Egyptian empire still had pharaohs. So it is very old. It's just I wouldn't say it's the oldest, but there's a case to be made that every single religion comes from the same source. I mean, there are authors who have tried to put them all into one huge like branch tree pattern diagram, and I don't know how successful that has, that idea has been in the consciousness, but it definitely makes sense. I think I would agree with that in a certain sense. But what we're seeing here again with this other slide, you can see how the Egyptian gate here is modeled after the temples at Dendera, Esna North, and even a temple at Hermopolis Magna, which is called Ash Moon. And this is all very important because right behind the cemetery gate, a man named Jehudi Ashmoon is buried. And this is the founder of the colony of Liberia. Okay. So to bring it
Mhm.
all back to slavery and Native Americans and all that, the colonists in New England, as forward as they were with the whole idea of slavery, really they were kind of the more racists in the equation in a certain sense, because they didn't want to live next to the freed slaves. They wanted to ship them back to Africa. This was kind of a popular idea in the New Haven area.
When I was a kid and I saw Gone with the Wind, I was totally baffled by how, if they were the most racist society, that they would have the black slaves raise their children. Like I didn't, because in the North, it's actually in my observation, and I've lived in Massachusetts and New York and Georgia and Texas and California, the North is more segregated.
Right, right. Well, and
And
it,
I just didn't understand, like, I was like, "I don't really understand this, what" it's just a nuanced thing, and I think it's a little more complicated, but I'm with you, I think it
mm.
probably is more racist.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I'm not a composite expert on this whole subject, but there's a case to be made there that, we're getting a cover story with the Civil War. That's not my expertise, but it definitely connects to this whole conversation in a certain way. So, with Ashmoon, though, it's very interesting. He wasn't really a member of the New Haven community, but he found himself buried in this cemetery. And you have to wonder why. He founded the colony of Liberia, probably funded by people in New Haven, and they were trying to ship people back to Africa, and it's kind of a dangerous voyage. They weren't really the most skilled seafarers, so a lot of people died on the long voyage across the ocean down there. But anyways, he passes away in Boston. Takes They take his body to New Haven and bury him right in the front of the cemetery, and considering his last name is Ashmoon, he physically spent time in Africa. You have to wonder if there's some kind of esoteric pattern syncretism going on here, because the street next to the cemetery is named Ashman Street, right? Why would they name it that after this guy? Again, not a member of the community, somebody who went and did this kind of weird historical thing that a lot of people have forgotten about in Africa. The country still exists. I mean,
They
they've
say it's a
actually had
CIA outpost, but
well, oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at some of the warlords that have come out of there. One guy got arrested, escaped prison in New York, and made it back to Africa. I mean, how do you do that if you don't have some connections? So, yeah, the whole country of Liberia is very fishy. They've had some pretty bloody civil wars, and it's just a terrible thing that's going on in Africa all around, in a sense, due to colonial impact, but more particularly, it's pronounced in that area. So, anyways, Ashmoon Street, this man Ashmoon, and then we have this gate that symbolizes, in a way, uh, Hermopolis Magna, which was called Ashmoon. Not only was this an important city in Egypt, but it was the sacred city of eight. Okay, it was the city where Thoth, Hermes, right? The magical god. I mean, all of the occult sciences go back to this guy. He is worshipped as the central deity in Hermopolis Magna. What's going on at Yale? Well, Yale is this, like, super institution that's not only revolutionized the country through its, educational literacy, the Revolutionary War. I mean, on a federal level, they've made a huge impact. Yale, Harvard. I mean, all of the Ivy League schools, particularly Yale, Harvard, and UPenn. But when it comes to Yale in chemistry, they have changed the entire globe, okay? Because the first use of rubber was developed at Yale. The first use of oil into gasoline was created at Yale. So we're talking about, like, the foundation of, the modern, economy that we're looking at, this, like, gasoline automobile boom that we had with World War One and World War Two, where now all of a sudden the world's totally different. We have these suburbs developing, people move out of the cities because they have cars. I mean, think about how much the world changed with the automobile, and that happened at Yale essentially. Not only that, you take the timetable back a little bit. Eli Whitney improved the cotton gin. He gets credit for inventing it, but he improved the cotton gin to the point where they were able to, you know, create this sort of factory situation where you can have less workers doing maybe longer hours, paying less wages to them all. Obviously, at certain points in history, they were paying them no wages, but there's always a cost to doing
yeah,
business.
you
So,
gotta feed them or they die, so
right. So
you
they,
have
they
so many
limit,
people that I mean, that is definitely a feature of some historical slave
right.
societies that you have so many people that you do work them to death, and then it controls the population, which is like a whole 'nother
Well,
level
and
of depravity, but yes, yes, definitely, I've thought of that with the factories, and the more efficient it is, and the
mm,
less you can pay them because there's more people than vying for those fewer jobs.
well, and all of this transmutation of society happens, in these places, Harvard and Yale primarily. And if you think about Thoth, alchemically, this god master of transmutation, all these hermetic sciences, I mean, how does it not? I mean, how do you not see that in Yale's sort of impact on culture? They're really alchemists in a sense. And go ahead, funny enough, alchemy was accepted in New England culture. As a matter of fact, the first uh, governor of the colony of Connecticut, who basically paved the way for Yale to become Yale, was an alchemist. His name was John Winthrop the Younger. He was the son of John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts colony, and he was a practicing alchemist. He was one of the first members of the Royal Society. He was, you know, spy in a certain sense himself, kind of sharing information about the New World with England and London and all of the financial interests in London who were trying to basically beat the Dutch out of all of the resources here in New England, because the Dutch had made it to, you know, the Hudson River first, not first in history, but, you know, the first European trading nation to make it into Europe or into America at the Hudson River. So they had this competition already. So they were very fierce to get in here and establish, you know, these ports and all of the colonies that evolved into states, and all of these port towns and cities that evolved into, you know, state capitals and whatnot. So yeah, it's very interesting to see where this has all you know, unfolded to. And in the heyday of, like, I don't know, I think they call it the occult revival in the 1800s, when people were really fascinated with like these occult things because of what had been found in Egypt a couple decades prior. And, you know, this sort of spiritualism movement and theosophy are kind of sweeping the country. So all of these things were a little more in, you know, vogue back then to begin with. But, you know, to this day, there are groups of people like Skull and Bones who I think they rely on the symbolic power of these structures for their initiations, for their ceremonies, and for their dominion over the country. Because, you know, all of this, you know, geomancy with building buildings in certain positions. You mentioned the center point of the landmass of the earth, which not only is in Egypt, but it's actually the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid of Egypt is mathematically at the center of the landmass of the entire earth. So, wow. I mean, what does that tell you? And it's not a tomb, folks. It's far more complicated than that. But I'm not the expert to dive into that. There's far greater folks than I who've spent lifetimes diving into the pyramid mystery. I only know a bit, but either way, it connects. And they use this geomantic magic in a place like America. And it's just so funny because I'm going to show you another slide here, Monica. And I mean, tell me if this isn't astounding that most, if not all, of the Ivy League schools are situated on one straight line. I mean, look at that. On the left there, we see University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, Rutgers, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, all on this same straight line. I mean,
Did you say Columbia? And you know what another one is? Cornell, though.
right, and Cornell, I believe, is younger than the other colleges,
Right.
but it's up here. I actually have it on
Yeah.
another slide. There it is. It's kind of
Yeah.
funny because Cornell, Dartmouth, and Yale make this, like, triangle,
Triangle, I see that, yeah.
which I've
Yeah.
always that
No, that's
stood out to
interesting
me.
that that's a line. I see that. That's really, really interesting. And a lot of people, like, throw other names in there in the Ivy League, but those are the ones.
Right, yeah, and yeah, there's definitely, like, exceptions to this kind of rule here, but, Peter Shampoo, who studies earth grids and ley lines and earth anomalies, he's called this ley line the city ley line because, um, there's tons of cities just all on this line, from Boston to New Haven, New York City, Trenton, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mexico City are all on this one straight line that goes down the coast of the United States. And during the colonial times, they actually called this line Satan's Axes
Oh
because
my gosh,
yeah.
seriously?
So they called it because, you know, when they bought the land and whatnot, and they signed the treaties. They had kings establish charters, and the charters said,
Mm.
okay, you have your ports here along the coast, and then they would draw these like long straight lines into the interior of the United States going westward, and they'd say, okay, Carolina, you own that whole strip. Connecticut, you own that whole strip.
Hmm.
So, everything east or west of that line was pretty much wild for the first 50 to 100 years of American colonial history. And in the Christian mindset of a lot of these pilgrims and colonists, they felt like, okay, the Native Americans, we don't understand their religion. They might be some kind of ancient Jew. They seriously thought that they were ancient Jews, which there could be truth to that, because there has been voyages in ancient past from everybody from the Phoenicians to the Scandinavians to African kings. I mean, so many people came here before
Yeah,
Columbus.
so interesting. Yeah.
Aside from that fact, for the most part, these Christians felt like the Native Americans did not worship the same God as them, right? So that's why you see a lot of I could do that. Uh, Remind me.
Oh,
Um,
you're good. You can literally think and talk and read at the same time. The question is if you could recommend a good book or source to read more about the mysteries of the Egyptian pyramids. So I will put that in the show notes if Mark will provide it. And you
oh
can
yeah,
find that at monicasdeepdives.com.
oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, in their mind, everything that the Native Americans were doing was inherently satanic, and you even see that reflected in the uh, toponyms here in New England, right? You've been in New York, you've been in Massachusetts, right? You've seen like maybe places like Devil's Falls or the Devil's Den or the Devil's Hop Yard, or go on. There's this Devil's Mountain, I'm sure, and things like that. So the colonial mindset had this like religious superstitious aspect to it, where if there was a Native American spiritual place, they would call it, they're like in a sort of similar fashion that Rome did to the pagans, right? They would kind of propagandize their enemy and say, oh, they worship Satan, they sacrifice children to some weird god. I mean, the Roman
Right.
Catholic Church did this during the Crusades, right? They used this sort of propaganda. So, yeah, and a
Did
good source.
they? I never could cry. I never looked into the Crusades. I feel like,
Well, in a certain sense, what we see going on in the Middle East with these wars ever since the what is it, the Sinai Peninsula War in 1967, the first conflict after Israel became a real state. You see what some historians, some alternative researchers call, like, what is it, the Sixth Crusade or the Fifth Crusade.
oh, I see. Yeah.
Um, what it really is you have, these banking interests in Europe who were going to the
Yes.
Middle East to get resources and fight the Moors and the Turks, and
Yes.
eventually they toppled Constantinople, and they took all the Moors out of Spain. And once they opened up that port, the Straits of Gibraltar, then you see Columbus curiously, oh, Columbus figured out, oh, if you go this way, you make it to the New
Yeah,
World. They knew about
of
that
course. Yeah.
for hundreds of years. Columbus was just like, hey, I'm gonna spill the beans because we're ready to tell the truth now. We have things wrapped up over there. But that's all coming from my research. I can't claim to have figured all that out myself. Someone that I just spoke to, Dr. Joseph Farrell, writes about what I just discussed, and he also writes about the pyramid. So for the person who asked, a good source for Dr. Joseph or for pyramids would be Dr. Joseph Farrell's books, Giza Death Star. There are
Mm.
four different books: Giza Death Star Deployed, Revisited, and another one. So
Is that
he
his website's name? Because I always wanted to talk to him.
Oh, you should get in
Yes.
touch with them.
Alright,
Yeah,
I will.
I can send you a link. But yeah, he's great, and he's written, I mean, dozens of books, and I think 5 or 6 directly relating to the subject of pyramids and their role in history and their possible former, function, because they're not tombs. He thinks they're sort of like a giant weapon, hence the name Death Star. So but there are some people who think that it was like a chemical energy plant, in some sense. There are some people who think that it was like a portal that you could maybe like transmute your consciousness out of your body into maybe the afterlife, maybe ascend or something in a spiritual nature. So, yeah, I'm not an expert on any of that, but it's funny that that came up because this city ley line that we're looking at. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Um, that ley line, not only does it go through Mexico City, but it goes through the pyramid in Mexico City, Teotihuacan.
Oh, wow.
Right, and then get this, it goes all the way up into Great Britain, and it goes through Stonehenge. So,
Whoa.
all of those cities on the East Coast, big, powerful,
Yes.
influential cities, I mean, Boston, New York City,
Yeah.
Philadelphia, even Atlanta and New Orleans have their own special, like, energy and impact and culture, right? So, and Baltimore too, I mean, Baltimore's kinda like you know waste bin of that whole equation. And it's sorry to insult anyone in Baltimore, but if you've ever been there, I mean, it's really, really tragic. I mean, it's similar to kind of what's happened in New Haven. And even John Hopkins University, which I think is in Baltimore, was started by a Skull and Bones member.
Yes, definitely. I wanted to read this thing about the Russell Trust, and it's I don't want to take too much of your time, but it was so interesting. It said the Russell Trust was incorporated by William Huntington Russell as its president and Daniel Coit Gilman as its first treasurer. Gilman later went on to become president of the University of California, Berkeley. So I wonder if that was Coit Tower was after him, and Johns Hopkins University before leaving to become the first president of the Carnegie Foundation.
Right.
Gilman also served as one of the first board members of the Russell Sage Foundation, which I'm not familiar with, but talk about like Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and the Carnegie Foundation and a direct line to the Russell Trust. I mean, that alone, the Carnegie Foundation was attributed by Norman Dodd as being behind our involvement in World War One as a cultural change agent.
Right.
Very interesting stuff. When you see these connections, people want to say there's no they, there's no cabal, whatever, but you can't stop drawing the dots like connect themselves.
Well, and it's interesting because now we have the conspiracy equation has shifted, and I will get back to Gilman because there's more to say about him. But the conspiracy equation has shifted quite a bit because I think the idea that this all omniscient they controls the entire world is a bit stray from the truth. I think the truth is more closely like what we've been talking about, especially specifically what we talked about when I mentioned like this fifth crusade idea or sixth crusade idea, where the powers of the East Coast establishment with their religious extremist values use their power and wealth that they maintained after the world wars, and through conflicts and drug trade and human trafficking. Vietnam was a kind of really obvious example of that, but they used all that to then fulfill their ultimate goal, which was getting into the Middle East. And I don't think they've completed that goal yet, but that's essentially what their goal is to reconstruct Solomon's temple, whether ideologically or physically. They're trying to win back the Dome of the Rock and fulfill this sort of biblical prophecy. And to them, it's not essentially about like world domination as much as it's about being the elect, being God's chosen few, those
Hmm.
who have the right to rule. And when you study the monarchies of Europe, that's what they're obsessed with. They're obsessed with this bloodline going back to Jesus and this Hebrew priesthood of 24 priests that have this sort of maintenance of the holy bloodline. And even the pyramid goes back to that, because the pyramid supposedly can only be powered by someone who's of the bloodline.
Why do
So,
you say they're obsessed with the bloodline? Why do you think that now? Why what do you think Charles cares about that, or are you talking about the Dutch royal family? Like what makes you say that's still true today?
well, it's definitely interesting because on the contemporary side of things, I'm not versed enough to be able
Right,
to
right. Okay.
spot
I mean,
like,
it's almost self-evident, right? They do. care
Well,
so
I think
much about the
that
bloodline. Like, that's why Princess Diana, he had to marry her instead of Camilla because she was of the aristocracy and they had to bend the rules because it wasn't working anymore. And who knows what will really happen. I mean, I don't know if Kate is enough of the royal line or if it only passes through the male, but how can that be true? Because the queen was the female. So, I mean, they do care a lot about that. And it feels like if they're just titular heads, if they're really just figureheads, what difference does it make? But it does. It does make a difference. And I think the Dutch ones are more powerful, actually.
I
So maybe
think
that's where we should be, for me to
oh, well
focus on that would probably bring more answers.
yeah, well, there's a case to be made that Amsterdam and London were both kind of connected to that Venetian Genoese banking cabal situation, and again
Yes, Webster Tarpley used to do that stuff, and then he just
mm,
stopped
well
really engaging, but he had like a 3-hour one of the before there was podcasting and YouTube and stuff, there was from decades ago, Webster Tarpley had like 3 or 4 hours on the Venetian
mm,
bankers and the English royals and the Dutch royals. Very
yeah, and
interesting. I'll
I don't
find
wanna
that for the show notes too.
I don't wanna parrot, Farrell's work too much because he does write about the Venetian banking system, but this book, which here's your 1,001 book for you, Monica.
Yes, thank you.
Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, actually contributed Webster Tarpley contributed to this book, so
Oh, nice. I wonder if I have that. I might actually
you
have
might
that.
yeah, this is definitely like a foundational book for my research, and a lot of what I've taken, forward comes from this book, and I've tried to, dig in and find as many, you know, outside connections, really try to figure it all out. And it does seem to be more about, again, like this religious ideology and fulfilling prophecy less than it is about world domination. Because if you think about it, I mean, they had that sewn up pretty quickly, at least here in the United States and Canada and the Western world. Especially after World War II. So I don't know, maybe they want to keep that moving forward, and maybe they're using China and Russia in a sort of cat and mouse kind of way to get the other countries all to take a side until they have like, oh well, you're the odd man out kind of thing. I don't know. Again, I'm not into the contemporary politics enough to have a good opinion there, but I will one day because I'm sort of taking my time, and I've spent the most of my research like trying to figure out the foundation of Skull and Bones. Like, how could an organization like this become rooted in America, and where did it get rooted? And when I approached that subject, I found that New Haven was just so interesting, and there's so many things that you find doing this research that have been left out of American history courses for the most part, things that they don't teach you in school.
What was the exact name of that book?
Which oh, this
The
book
one
that
that
I held up,
yeah.
Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, and that's the main author is Chris Milligan. He's a publisher at Trine Day. They publish Whitney Webb's
Oh,
books,
yeah. Uh-huh.
which they're doing a lot of great work. I can't recommend Trine Day enough.
Nice.
And then yeah, Joseph Farrell, for people who want to get into that Venetian black nobility, is Swanson here. Jay Swanson just recommended Venetian Black Nobility.
Yes.
Book is great. Financial Vipers of Venice. Joseph Farrell really spells it out there in this book. So for people who are interested in Farrell, my interview with him is going to be out this month. I just interviewed him yesterday, and we talked a little bit about some of the things that we're talking about now, because that's just the way I work. It's kind
Yeah,
of
it's great. I mean, that's I do too. I just did so many. I did a bunch of deep dives on it started with some executive order on homelessness, and then there was an executive order before that on housing, and then I heard about the 15-minute cities, and then there's
mm,
this, the degrowth movement. And I ended up with like 6 deep dives on the same thing. And I worry that people get bored with it, but I'm like, no, there's like another rabbit hole. And that's what I like. I find that that's where you really, then you can answer all the questions. Who is they? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I have all the documentation because I, looked at it. I just got every resource possibly, exhausted the resources. I love that.
right. Well, and speaking of 15-minute cities, check this out. We have the Ninth Square district right here. And the title of this slide is Ivy League Geomancy, because New Haven was founded in 16 something, but this map I think comes from 1641, and this is the 9 square grid, the original 9 square grid of New Haven. And I think there's something going on here, and maybe this is a very early iteration of what became the 15-minute city model, because a lot of
Right.
this is like Christian utopianism. Like Francis Bacon kind of popularized this idea at that time of utopianism, right? And people tried to create these like perfect colonies where things would just sort of function in this utopian way, and then God would approve, and it would all sort of be cool. But as you can see, these dimensions are exactly the dimensions of the Temple of Solomon. You have this sort of cube 9 square orientation with the Temple of Solomon. And again, here we're talking about recreating scenes from the Bible here in New Haven in order to maybe enact prophecy or mesh well with what they see coming down the pike, right?
Yes, and I remember Sophia Smallstorm did some shows, some deep dives, I guess, of the as it were, on Sandy Hook, and that it was um, like a sister city to Tel Aviv for the center of a world religion that they were trying to. I think it might even be B'nai B'rith. Is that possible? Is that the world religion she was talking about?
Well,
But it was out of Connecticut, so not
yeah.
probably not too far from there.
I know a little bit about that whole situation. I know that's like a red flag topic, so we don't wanna get too
Oh,
far.
sorry. Yeah, I forget.
But
I
no,
get strikes, and then I have to go and, like, delete all my videos from YouTube so that I can just keep
no,
the channel. It's
don't
yeah, alright.
apologize to me. I'm just thinking ahead of your video. But,
I forget.
no,
It's
but there was
live. It's there. It's gonna be there unless I take it down.
oh, well, there was
Whatever. I
there
don't
was
care.
a church involved in that whole situation. I don't think it was B'nai B'rith, but there was a church involved in that whole situation. But
Yeah, ouch.
I
I
forget
shouldn't have
the
said the
guy.
word.
Oh, it's alright, it's alright.
I don't know if
So,
it's
yeah,
alright.
Sandy Hook and Newtown, Connecticut, they're kind of like in this like river valley that's sort of next to New Haven County. It might be in New Haven County, but it's really not that close to New Haven, but definitely connected. I mean, Sikorsky Helicopters is right down the river from
Oh my god.
Sandy Hook, and Sikorsky is huge. This whole city is built on military industrial complex, right? And like we're talking about Winchester rifles, we're talking about Browning, Remington, we're talking about
Wow.
the submarines in Groton, which is a little bit east of
Yeah.
here. So yeah, and of course banking and insurance as well. But
But the green, that
how many
picture is so
places do you
fascinating.
see that? Yeah, how many places do you see a pentagram like that
And it
on the
looks
public park?
it's also reminiscent of the Illuminati stuff with the, what do you call it? The protractor or whatever they call that, like compass. Just
Right.
I can see that kind of, and if you
There.
back out again, those, I hate to say it, but those white spires on the church, they look like little Klansmen. I
Oh,
don't
back
know.
here in the
It's super
uh,
creepy.
foreground of this picture?
In the background of the upper left picture, in the upper left corner of your picture, it looks like a couple little Klansmen looking over the, uh
Oh.
the pentagram. It's just weird because you see, I know I hesitate to see symbolism everywhere, but there's no rhyme or reason to those paths that really looks like, from this angle, it looks like either the, Masonic symbol or a pentagram.
Yeah, I definitely think it's, 2 pentagrams, maybe even like a unicursal hexagram, but in the sort of, zoom out, when you really zoom out, it may even have something to do with this sort of, tetragrammaton sigil type magic, which is far too complicated for us to get into right now. But symbolically speaking, the three churches here, which are pretty much the foundation of the New Haven colony, this is where New Haven started. this central one was a meeting house, and that's where all of the bodies are buried under. They actually, when they reconstructed the church, they basically took the base level of the backyard, which was a cemetery, and they made it the basement of a portion of this church. So you can actually walk into the basement of this church, and it's like a crypt. They still have the tombstones preserved and whatnot. But
Yeah. And that's
but
not theory. This is here, I'm just putting up the
oh,
URL for a Yale
yeah,
Daily News
theorizing,
article
yeah.
about 10,000 skeletons under the green.
Wow, they say 10,000. That might be an exaggeration. I've read 6, but they did take some out when they created that Grove Street Cemetery that I showed you earlier. They exhumed some of the more important
Oh,
bodies and reburied them in their own private, exclusive cemetery for the rich and the wealthy.
oh my god.
And the churches here are all facing the east, which, this makes sense. Temples are always oriented towards the east. Throughout, Western culture, Eastern culture, they're always oriented towards the east. I think it's almost universal because that's where the sun rises, right? And all of these churches are on Temple Street, which at one point in time there wasn't a road, bisecting the green, but nowadays there is, and it's called Temple Street. And during the BLM protests, they actually made like a street piece of artwork where they spray painted using a huge stencil the words Black Lives Matter on Temple Street, which is kind of ironic considering, all the things that have happened in New Haven, the Black Panther trials, the New Haven Black Panther trials, which included Barry Seal, and of course the really gruesome details of colonial history that we mentioned earlier, slave trade and slave hangings, and all the sorts of things that happened in a common ground like this. So, yeah, and to this day, New Haven's Green is owned by a private group of I think they call them like the Five Planters or something like that. And it's basically like a private association that for the most part respects free speech. I mean, they allow anybody to come and voice their opinions on the green. I mean, every like Saturday or something that you'll see like the Black Israelites on the corner kind of doing their thing with the megaphones, and from like I said, Occupy Wall Street to all these other movements come to the green for these expressions of free speech and the right to demonstrate and the right to protest, which in a sense is quintessentially American. And New Haven is a American colony through and through. At one point, the New Haven colony claimed land all the way down in Philadelphia. The whole body of Long Island in New York was claimed by New Haven. So
Really?
some of the towns in Long Island, New York, are actually connected to this whole family network of East Coast people. Actually, William Huntington Russell, to bring him up, the Huntington family started Huntington, New York, which is like a pretty wealthy area of Long Island, right? So, and that's right across the water. So they take their yachts and whatnot across. It's no problem for them to travel across Long Island Sound. So, yeah, it's definitely like, and again, all this stuff because you've been in New York, you understand the culture. All of Connecticut from Greenwich to maybe Bridgeport, where it kind of stops, that's like the bedroom community of New York
Oh,
City,
for
right?
sure, yeah.
Super wealthy, super affluent. There are, impoverished pockets within that, but it kind of stops at Bridgeport, which used to be like a bustling port town. Barnum, P.T. Barnum had his, all of his stuff set up in Bridgeport, and then New Haven's kind of like a little bit removed from that, but still a part of this whole network. And the New Haven train monopoly was a part of this whole Rockefeller monopoly. Yale's tallest building, the Harkness Tower, was built by Standard Oil money. Stephen Harkness was a benefactor of the Standard Oil fortune, and he was a graduate of Yale and paid for this whole tower to be built. It's this huge memorial tower, but the connections, they just go so far, so deep. And I know we're getting to 2 hours here, so I don't know how much longer you
Yeah.
want to go, but I could keep going if you're
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to just settle in with you because I know it's a big, big topic, and uh, I guess for me, so you're like, if you're gonna call it Skull and Bones, like, you have to, like, really dig into that, but I feel like this is more about, the geocentric emanations out of New Haven, and that there's a lot going on there. It's not just Skull and Bones,
Mm.
but does because there are even other secret societies that are closely related to Skull and Bones.
Mhm.
And I guess maybe we can make a little more delineated. So Skull and Bones, would you say that, I mean, what you were saying was that you don't like feel, strictly speaking, this is one unified cabal that is got its mindset on controlling the world. And I would say, like, for me, I always, there's a battle in my mind for whether the cabal is completely unified, completely hierarchical. On the one hand, that's a question: how much competition is there at the top, and is it around the world? And then the other thing I wonder about is it mystical? Is it interdimensional? Or is it really purely materialistic, and they just use that stuff as either a distraction or a control mechanism? So I guess, my question is kind of like, what is the true nature of power on Earth and in the universe, and how does Skull and Bones plug into that? That's just the quest I'm on.
I love that question. Yeah, I'm trying to answer that myself. I think it's a great question to ask. When it comes to Skull and Bones, I think it's a recipe of all factors that you just kind of described, but specifically with the process of initiation. This is a purely human thing. Every culture around the world, from the most remote tribes in jungles and islands to, you know, the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians, they all had initiations, right? And every culture does. And it's just a way to trust, confidence, in a person, to display that, to demonstrate that loyalty. And also, it's almost like they put people through a near death experience in order to show them that, okay, your life here is not what you thought it was, it's what we tell you it is. And religions have done this for centuries, right? You give someone a near death experience or a hallucinogenic experience, and their whole perspective will shift. And if they're plastic and moldable enough, you can kind of shift it into a direction that you want. So it's definitely a control mechanism. It's definitely a function of power to initiate people. And the university system from Oxford and Cambridge in England, which basically established Harvard and Yale here in New England,
In
and then
Cambridge.
yeah, well, right, Cambridge is right there next to Harvard, but Harvard and Yale basically started all the other schools. I mean, Brown University was founded by a former president of Yale. I think outside of like William, the College of William and Mary, most of the other schools were inherently connected to this, Harvard and Yale, Oxford and Cambridge situation because of, these secret societies like the Society of Cincinnati, like the American Philosophical Society. Benjamin Franklin was given an honorary degree from Yale, and he was all connected to the University of Pennsylvania. So it's all, interloped like that. And I think they essentially were able to manufacture the culture in the direction that suited their economic needs through education. And that got more complicated over the years, but eventually a German iteration, Prussian really, the Prussian Academy system of education. This got implemented into the United States through Skull and Bones, and Anthony Sutton pretty much spells that out in his book American
That's the one I have.
Establishment.
Yes.
Yeah, and he posits in this book that, the Order of Skull and Bones is controlling education through the Rockefeller Institute, the American Economic Association, the U.S. Naval Academy, UNESCO, and the Union Theological Seminary, all of which have had Skull and Bones members as, foundational or influential members of their society. And then when we look at the other sort of who's of, when people want to get behind the term they and they want to figure out, okay, who is they? Well, Skull and Bones seems to be in the mix of all of these orders. I'm trying to find the exact chart that Anthony Sutton has on here because I don't want to leave any out. I can probably name a few off the top of my head, but I don't want to leave any out because it's a really interesting way of looking at it, because they don't have to have control over every single order. They just have to have a guy in each order, right? So they have a guy at Bohemian Grove. They have a guy within the CFR. They have a guy within the Bilderberg group. They have a guy, in China as an ambassador, or maybe even in the government, right? So they're all connected. And you mentioned Gilman before. I wanted to get back to him. He is a part of the sort of, I don't know, fourth or fifth, sixth, seventh, like class of Skull and Bones. Like he's in maybe like the second numeral of classes, like 10 or 12. So 1856 is when he founded the Russell Trust. This is sometime after Skull and Bones had already kind of made its way into society, into controlling Yale. But he wasn't alone. There was Andrew D. White and Timothy Dwight. Okay, so Gilman, White, and Dwight were the troika. That's what Anthony Sutton calls them, because they were incredibly influential after leaving Skull and Bones. You mentioned what Gilman did, and Gilman's probably the most interesting, but we also have White, who went on to work with the University of Berlin. He was the president of Cornell University and a U.S. ambassador to Berlin. Now, keep in mind, Berlin was Germany back then. In the 1800s, there was no German state. It was just, there was Berlin, there were like, city states essentially, and the Holy Roman Emperor types, right? So
Yes.
Timothy Dwight, University of Berlin again, the Yale Theological Seminary, which is very influential, with religion throughout the country. And then he was also president at Yale College. So these three guys were kind of like the ones who took the Skull and Bones message and waved that banner through the circles of the robber barons, right? Because that was the robber baron period in the mid 1800s. This is when the robber barons were coming to power, right? So you have to keep in mind that they were sort of a part of that, but also influencing a lot of those types, Flagler, Rockefeller, Harkness. I mean, all these big, you know, titans of industry as we think of them now. I mean, they weren't all together like these altruistic, philanthropic geniuses that we kind of give them credit as being. They were really more like a cabal of guys working in tandem to sort of create monopolies.
I have a show coming out, just like you have this about to release. I'm about to release one I did with a lawyer friend of mine, Eric Buchanan, and he's just a pretty straight shooting conservative small government guy. Doesn't always go down the rabbit hole, but he was talking about the progressive era, because my idea, and I think Murray Rothbard wrote a book on it even, is that they instituted the era of regulation and antitrust and everything in order to cement their positions as the oligopoly organizations in these industries, that if you put up enough regulatory barriers, nobody can ever compete with you. So it's funny because we definitely never hit on any of this stuff at all, but I do have this show about that exact era. And I kept asking him, I was like, but this, I don't think this was just a political moment that emerged organically from the grassroots and happened to lock in for 100 years, like the one oil company, the one steel company. And then to think of the Carnegie Endowment, these things have such long lasting power over our, even just the way we think, because of the institutions in academia. For starters, I mean, they get a grip of your mind and there's no hope after that.
Well, it's one part idolatry, one part fantasy, maybe one part myth, but it's definitely a part of the American consciousness. This kind of pick them up by their bootstraps type of character that they use to describe folks who changed American culture during the Industrial Revolution. When, in fact, I mean, You talk to a guy like Dr. Joseph Farrell, who spends a lot of time looking at the ancient past. In his opinion, we've devolved technologically. So a lot of the innovations that we're seeing happen in the 1800s that contributed to the Industrial Revolution, maybe we can think of those things rather as like a recreation of the wrong type of technology. Like, we did advance our ability to manipulate materials into new forms of technology, but we failed to integrate the mental evolution that supposedly had occurred from the
Yes.
Renaissance and the leap out of the Dark Ages, which again some people think wasn't even all that dark, considering the horrors of
Oh,
the
yeah.
20th century. It's like we might as well call now the Dark Ages, right?
It's
So
that dichotomy or lack of synchronicity or whatever, synchronization is, like, at the heart of Star Trek. Like, I used to just love Star Trek, and the prime
mm,
directive is you can't go into, civilization and mess with it. You can't let them know you're there. You can't infuse technology into a a culture that hasn't created it on its own, and I really can't stop it. It bothers me. It really rankles me or whatever that we seem to be as a society incapable of handling the responsibility of this technology, which in the hands of these capital T, they, the people you're talking about, if you want to call it Johns Hopkins or Skull and Bones or whoever, the people who are obviously collude on setting global policies, they are using and plotting to use this technology against us and against our humanity and against our spirituality. And it upsets me like that God, what is it in our Father, like, it's thy kingdom come, thy will be done. I just think, is this really God's will, that we should be enslaved by technology that is just we're not capable of battling against and don't have the maturity to use in a good way? It bothers me. I feel like there's something wrong. There's an asynchronicity.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely a case to be made. I mean, you look at who kicked off the age of empire, which led to the Industrial Revolution, and it was John Dee, an alchemist, right? I mean, and not just him alone, but types like him, right? And this whole circle of people in the Royal Society. I mentioned John Winthrop the Younger, who was
Yes.
Connecticut's alchemist governor. I mean, these are the men who took medieval alchemy and ancient esotericism and brought it forth through the Renaissance into the new world and used all those alchemical secrets maybe to recreate, like I said, technology from that, hate perspective rather than that love perspective, that negative frequency rather than a positive one.
I have to say, I just eyeballed Winthrop's biography here. I don't even know what site I was looking at, and it said that as this alchemist, and his father, I guess, was the Massachusetts governor, they are attributing to his work, his presence, that the establishment of the medical industry up in that area. I know, like, Massachusetts, Cambridge, and stuff has like a lot of biotech. I have family up there, and that's just the job. You think, oh, I didn't know he was, whatever, that scientific, but it's not. They just drive everybody into that because it's such a huge industry there, and they literally are drawing that line. And you're talking about old world alchemy. You're talking about John Dee. I'm talking about mind control. And then we've got like the most powerful movement, the most powerful lever for that right now was the COVID thing and the vaccines. Like I've never weighted like the big medicine as heavily as I weighted big energy and big finance and big defense in the military industrial complex. I underestimated the power of like big pharma, big medicine. And now I feel like it seems to me the most powerful thing in the world at this moment. And it drives right back to this, they're attributing that ground zero in New England to Winthrop.
Mm. Now get this, okay? So what was the biggest, most important resource in New England? I mean, culturally. Well, there were probably more important resources than this, but culturally, it made a huge change on the rest of the world. Do you have a guess?
Gee, I mean, let me just think about it
In
for a
my hand.
second.
I'll give you a hint.
Okay, give me a hint.
It's in my hand. That's what I'm
Oh, it's in your hand. Tobacco? No. I mean, I
Yeah,
know it's not
yeah,
tobacco that you're
it's
smoking, but I don't
tobacco.
know, whatever it
It's
is.
tobacco.
It might be tobacco because as Joe, not a Fed, says, "Holy crap, Mark, I gotta say you are one of the clearest expressors of complex thoughts that I have ever had the pleasure to hear." And it's really impressive. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say that you really got a gift. And I
Well,
don't know what you're
you
smoking, but you're smoking mind-altering substances, and you've got one lobe tied behind your back, and you're still able to express these complex thoughts perfectly. I mean, you're really speaking to us from a different dimension, indeed.
Well, I'll say this is a 10-year, spiritual journey. I've been smoking cannabis and tobacco every day for 10 years, and I say that because I understand the stigma and the shame that some people who use this medicine feel, and, maybe I can be proof that this doesn't affect your intelligence at all. In fact, I think cannabis has made me smarter. So thank
Yeah.
you for saying that, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to say that because that's something that means a lot to me. It's one of the reasons why I podcast because I don't think cannabis is this like stupefying thing if you use it correctly. And why I brought that up is because we see tobacco as this medicine. Who's we? Me, anybody who has a perspective that's close to the earth, who's used real tobacco, they understand that tobacco is not this thing that'll give you cancer. It's a medicine, right? Obviously, the blunt wrap that I'm smoking right now that I bought at a gas station, probably not the most medicinal, but it's the best I can do living where I live, right? So, but cannabis is definitely medicinal. I actually know where this was grown. A friend of mine grew it. It's organic, so I'm like pretty particular about getting the right medicine. But these are medicines, and think about how they were bastardized, right? Tobacco was taken, it was, raped, basically. I mean, it's a feminine plant. It's a feminine plant, and it's being used for its, you know, lowest quotient value, right? It's being mass produced, it's being cheapified, it's being brought down to the lowest quality so that they can get the most money for it. And that's what happened to this plant. And this is a sacred plant that Native Americans still use to this
Yes.
day in religious ceremonies.
I was a heavy smoker for a long time, and somebody in all sincerity, and I loved it, gave me a poster that did have an American Indian smoking a pipe of some kind, and it just said, tobacco, use it in a sacred way. And recently I was just going through some old papers. I've got to move. And my daughter, who I mean, I can get flack for this, but as my mother would say, when I used to smoke cigarettes, I said, "Mom, pray for me to stop smoking." And she said, "I will not. You worry about your black heart, not your black lungs." She's like, "Maybe if you die a little sooner, you'll sin less." So she just thinks your priority, and I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but I'm just saying she felt your priority is to obsess about your health, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So my daughter absconded with my poster of the tobacco, use it in a sacred way. But I validate what you're saying about that history here. And these, I wanted to point out, I've said this a few times recently, but I'd like to say it to you, that these leaves, these plants are the medicinal plants are gifts from God directly in their form. And it's just like gold or other things that have this perfect use. Like they're perfect. They have counteractive agents within it. Like there's just, I love CBD. And I actually think it's probably, maybe it's wrong to strip it out, but I think what I'm getting is just the male plant. Like I don't even think I'm
Oh, you're
actually
not
doing
doing
it.
anything
Yeah.
wrong. You're not
Mhm.
doing anything wrong. Yeah, CBD, I mean, when the colonists came here, the wilderness, they called it a wilderness, but the Native Americans, they didn't have to plant in the same way that the Europeans did because the land was abundant. You had hemp, you had, corn, you had squash growing in great numbers, and people talk about, the colonists saying, "Oh, there's hemp everywhere, there's tobacco everywhere," and these guys, they just go along, they pick off what they need, and they leave the rest behind, and, I think that's just like, we don't have to get into the whole agrarian relationship there, but I think it's definitely something that humanity's lost touch with, specifically with medicine. Why I bring this up in the equation with alchemy is because all of these plants that become pills. I mean, think about a pill. A pill is just different molecules that they're able to, recreate using plants or minerals in some cases, and in other cases, which are kind of, in my opinion, gross, artificial, right? They're able to
They
artificially create healers,
bypass they bypass what God gave you to that works interactively with these plants, your smell, your vision, your taste, like, it literally like, so you can die from taking pills because your natural defense mechanisms, which include your sensory perception, are completely bypassed.
Well, and think about it in this even like Dr. Moreau sort of way. They can take like some cell that belongs to a pig, and they can transmit it into something that works in a human body, right? So, we have all these sort of um, magical, alchemical things going on with our consumption because we consume these medicines, right? It's no different than the way we consume our foods, but we've been trained and conditioned to think that these little pills can, heal us, right? And that happened in the 50s and 60s, but it really started with these alchemists in New England who were kind of like the only source of healing in the community. Like John Winthrop the Younger was, beloved by the colony of Connecticut because of his healing capabilities, and he was very smart in the way that he prescribed things to people. He was actually a part of the reason why the witch trials never really took off in Connecticut. There were some witch trials here when he was in London, when he left Connecticut to go to London, because he was born in America, I believe. There were some witch trials that went on. He came back and he was like, "What's all this going on? You folks don't even know the first thing about magic. How can you accuse this person of being a witch?" So he clearly had, very different perspective than we're given. We're told these Puritans were superstitious and everything was devil this, devil that, but there were some Puritans who were boiling body parts and eating them, burning body parts
Oh my
in
god.
the ashes because they had this Paracelsian alchemical view of medicine, and that's where you get this idea of like the New England vampires, where, a dead relative who passed away from what they called consumption would be underground. And if somebody who had caught that illness, they didn't know it was an illness, was dying of it themselves, tuberculosis, they thought, oh, that person who passed away must be absorbing their life energy from beyond the grave. So they would go and dig that body up and, maybe cut their head off or do something to them to make their body in the afterlife weakened, so they couldn't affect people who were living. They actually thought in this way, right? So there were some weird views on medicine back then. Specifically, when you look into like vampires and witches, you find these kind of weird medical stories, believe it or not. But when it comes to medicine, we've seen the gifts of God inverted,
Yes,
bastardized.
and let's wrap on this, and I just that so for me, it's really funny. One podcaster, I feel like it was the Timeline Earth guy, saying that like the gun rights and drug rights, like as flip sides of the same philosophy, are almost inversely correlated. So in places where they advocate for cannabis rights, they are usually gun control freaks, and places where people advocate for gun rights, they're often, pro drug war, which to me on the margin, and I'm a huge fan of gun rights because I think that we're in a tyrannical pathocracy and it's our only hope. But these are gifts directly from God that we have. I'm not going to say evolved. I don't like that word, but we've emerged, we've grown, we've developed alongside. So like that asynchronism, that technology and our spiritual development as a society, that bothers me. We even had that synchronicity with guns, like as a part of a culture where a 12-year-old had a gun rack, or whatever. When the first time you get your truck, you get a gun rack on it. Then that as actually reduces accidents and uses it for good. But cannabis is, God's gift to man, and to think that a government has the right to
Mm,
stand between you and that weed that grows in your backyard. Like, there's just so many things wrong with that. I really just drives
mm,
me nuts. But
yeah.
yes, I'm happy to see that you benefit from it and obviously bring some insights that are whatever makes you who you are. I wouldn't change a thing. I absolutely love getting an insight into what you're thinking. I love it. And your research is great too.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been really fun. I will say one last comment on that point. Connecticut is a concealed carry state and it's legal to smoke weed. So we might be a little bit more forward in that realm. I'd like to live in a place like New Hampshire, but they, even as freedom oriented as they are, to your point, do not allow people to possess cannabis. I might be decriminalized, but it's still illegal there. So yeah, I'm with you. I don't love living in Connecticut, but those are two of the benefits. People are pretty cool about guns and also cool about weed. So, yeah.
I have some friends who live up in, I think, the northwest corner of Connecticut, and they have like jillions of chickens, and it's just like
Hmm.
it's actually quite rural. And they recently were trying to pass a local ordinance against owning chickens. And thankfully, people came out en masse and not from mass, but en masse, and put a damper on
Yeah.
that. So I guess there's hope for Connecticut. I think Connecticut's got
Oh,
a
yeah.
diverse,
Well, that's the Ethan Allen Highway area up there, and if anybody lives in the tri-state area, take a drive up Route 7 and just go through Connecticut into Massachusetts, and if you have the time, make it up to Vermont. It's probably one of the most beautiful corridors in all of New England, that I've ever driven on. It's just really beautiful, so
and I
your
can
friends are
only
blessed
imagine.
to live there.
Say that again.
I say your friends are blessed to live there.
Yes, I know, and it's cheap and everything really fantastic. So,
Mm,
especially in the age of egg shortages, which I consider eggs to be like weed and gold, like God's gift, like the
right.
perfect thing. It's
Oh, yeah.
basically free. They just crap them out. But so I love that. So yes, I have been taking notes along the way, so I'm going to put a lot of our resources in show notes. I would love it if you would send me anything else that you want to include. And it's just been a joy. And I hope that you will bring more to my show and my listeners of anything you want to talk about, anything that
Oh,
tickles your
yeah.
fancy. I would love to have you back.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll say that for everybody who's interested in this Skull and Bones stuff, it's been sort of seeping into the podcast. So various episodes, you'll hear me bring it up. And why I'm doing that is not just because I'm interested in researching it, but I'm actually culminating all of these interviews into a new podcast series. It's going to be a one-off. It's not going to be something that goes on forever. It's going to be like a season, one season of a podcast dedicated entirely to New Haven and Skull and Bones. And the first episode is going to come out this month on 3/22, March 22nd, because
Nice.
Skull and Bones' little number is 3/22, and we're in the year 2023, which is 3/22 backwards. So it's double,
Wow.
and it's 10 years after I kind of got in and ingraded in all this info. So for me, it's very significant. And I hope everybody checks it out and supports the project because it's definitely, it's something I'm nervous about. I don't want to be, totally spilling the beans, and I live right near these guys.
I
So
know the feeling. Yes,
I don't know
indeed, I do.
exactly how it's going to come out yet. It might be on a totally different RSS feed unassociated with my show, but it's going to be like a kind of compilation of sections of interviews put in a narrative to kind of take people through the story, like from beginning to now.
That'll be super cool. So keep us posted, and I will keep my listeners posted anytime you want to give them a shout out about where to find you or what to do. That's great. I am going to tell you in advance, I have to go tend to my mom. So I'm going to say goodbye to you and going to click off when the outro is finished. But I want everyone to just make a note. You can find this show on and all the show notes on my website, monicasdeepdives.com. But this is Mystic Mark from the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. So you want to hear, he really delivers just show after show, long form. I love the sound, the pace, and the content's fantastic. Really high marks on your show, which I love.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I mean, people stuck around the whole time. This was a marathon, maybe my longest show ever, but I just really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. This is Monica Perez, and this has been a live dive.